Okay. One of the important things that we work with as designers, as communication specialists, is type. Now, what we saw in last tutorials, I just used a T or go and click the type tool. I simply click and then type, right? By the way, this lorem ipsum is a piece of Latin that has been used since the beginning of the printing press when we just want to look at how letters flow and how things are going to work out. You can go in your preferences and it won't automatically fill with lorem ipsum. I left it there because yours is probably doing it, but most of the time I keep mine off. The other way that we can add type, T for type, is when we're in the type tool. First grab the type tool, we grab a box. And now what we see is that we have a type box instead of a line of type. And for this exercise, that's probably going to be our best bet so that we can maybe, depending on time, get into a few things. The first thing I want to talk about, though, I know, grabbed the wrong layer. The first thing I want to talk about is typeface. A lot of people say when they look at this type that it is Avenir is the font. Avenir is the font face or typeface. This is actually Avenir Next Medium 9 point if we were to actually be specific about the word font, but we'll talk about that more. Today I want to think about the meaning of typeface and how it influences our design. So let me turn off lorem ipsum layer here and write something that hopefully you've heard more than once in your life. I love you. Okay. We'd all love to see that, hear that, experience that, whatever the case may be, make it a little bigger. And that's nice and plain and to the point. If I hold the Option key and drag down, I'm in the Move tool, Option key, drag down. What would this feel like in say Times New Roman? I prefer Times. Most of you have Times New Roman. Same basic font, except Microsoft knocked somebody off so they didn't have to pay licensing fees. By the way, yeah, you'll get used to it. When you see that typed, you hear a voice in your head saying it. Each one says it slightly differently, correct? Let's go in and try this with something else, or I'll show you a little trick. If you go up here where we see the typefaces, and we can use arrow up. Come on. Some days we can, some days we can't. Should be able to. Here we go. Arrow up, arrow down. Does that say I love you in a whole different way? It's just a statement of fact, maybe something. That's not what your mom says when she says I love you, right? I'm not a wild hippie person maybe, or something like that. How about everybody's favorite font, face, or typeface? See, I do it too. And the one that will brand you forever as someone who does not take graphic design seriously, Comic Sans. Don't ever do it. Just don't do it. The point is, each typeface has nuances. Each one causes us to hear things differently in our head. So when we're trying to craft a message, when we're trying to speak to an audience, what voice should they be hearing? And even if we're saying the same thing, there are subtle nuances, subtle differences. Let's then make this Helvetica. I think that one up there's a medium, so we'll do a Helvetica medium. They're similar. Do they say the same thing? I jump in and type Arial, except I don't want to burn and for using Arial. Again, another typeface that Microsoft thought it was cheaper to hire someone to knock off than to actually pay the person who created it for their intellectual property. So I always use Helvetica instead of Arial. You won't notice a lot of difference, but as you start to study typefaces, you will find there are some differences. Baskerville. And let's see what else we got. I'm trying to stick with all sans serif fonts here. Veneer. The point is, do they all say the same thing, but they all say it with a slightly different voice? The more we want to control the language, the nitpickier we have to be about the subtleties of the voice of our typeface. Okay, so that's the most important thing we're going to think about when we're choosing typeface. Don't just take whatever's thrown out there. Make sure that you know what you're using and why you're using it and the voice you're hearing and how it differentiates itself between other words that you might be using or other choices that are out there. Okay. Another quick thing while we have this example, when you start to enlarge letters, especially beyond 12 points in height, you notice sometimes the spacing starts to get a little awkward. And that's where kerning comes in, using the type tool, T for type. If we come click right in the middle and use our Option or Alt key and an arrow, we can start to control space between individual letters. And there, I'd love to say, oh, you want it to be this all the time or that all the time. This is really a visual judgment call. If you think about proximity, we're making letters feel like they belong together as opposed to similar, dissimilar letters. So it's kind of based on the principle of proximity. As human beings, we read by shape, not by letter. That's why you never stack text. Let's see if I can do that better. Text tool. You never come over. I've just clicked and held on the T so I can see my other options. That's why you never stack text. Stack text. It is difficult to read. We have to stop and think about each letter along the way, which takes our mind off the message and puts it on the word we're trying to read. So don't ever stack text if need be. You can rotate the text, and we'll cover that some more later, but it's preferable to rotate the text one way or the other instead of stacking the text. You'll notice the spines of magazines and spines of books don't have stacked text, they have rotated text because we still recognize the shape. But so the main point here, as I digressed, was hold the T type tool, click in there, and pay attention to how easily it is to recognize a word. Do you notice there's just a little too much space right there for my taste? Right in there, it's getting good. There, it's too tight and looks awkward. And we should do this with every printed piece. Take the time to really go in and kern that type. Okay, so that introduces the concept of kerning to go along with typeface. As I jump back over to the original Lorem Ipsum I started this piece off with. Some other things that we're going to look at and think about besides our typeface and the kerning that takes place. So I double click in there. By the way, if you don't like things highlighted, Command H will hide that highlighting so you can kind of read it a little more clearly. You'll notice the whole thing is in a box because I drew this out as a text box as opposed to a line of text earlier. If I come to the top, or I can go under there, we can pull up the characters palette. Let me just pull that down here so we can see it. You notice I grabbed the name of the palette and pulled it off. Breakaway tabs here so we can kind of see what we're looking at. We have the height of the text. This is, when we say 9 points, we are talking about from the baseline of your descender, and we'll talk about that, to the top of your ascender is 9 points. There are 72 points in an inch. And so we're really 9/72 of an inch from the bottom of that P to the top of that L. So when we talk about a 9-point font or a 12-point font or a 14-point font, we are only talking a measurement of height. It has nothing to do with width. What we also see over here, and this is called leading, the space between lines of text is called leading. We used to put strips of lead between the metal letters, rows of letters, when we were laying out text in the olden days, and we've carried that word forward. So leading, since we are, don't forget we have it highlighted already, I hope. Highlight. I use the arrow up and the arrow down so I can kind of see how it feels. If I make it too close, it's squishy and difficult to read. Too far away, it doesn't have enough proximity to kind of hold together. Depends on how light or heavy I want the text to read on the page. By the way, the most common combination of font height and leading, and you'll find it in many, many magazines, is a 12-point, or books, 12-point type, 14-point leading. We say 12 over 14 is how we refer to that. And that's going to be your easiest to read and most common. See some 10 over 13 out there. By default, most software programs default to your leading being 1.2 times your font height. That's not exactly perfect. It rounds out on 12-point font to 14.4. It's fine, but it's not great. And so go in and control that, especially as your typeface gets taller. You definitely need to go in and control it because it's working by default off a multiplication factor, and so you're getting too much space between your lines of text there. Okay, so that's right there. Something else you will find that occasionally you need to do is tracking or letter spacing. I exaggerated that a little. I see people all the time try to stretch a typeface to make it fill a space. Typefaces are good typefaces are delicately balanced pieces of art. You start to stretch it, it doesn't feel and read correctly. So go in and try tweaking, and I'm just using the arrows right now to do it, but you can go in and type an exact number. Tweaking that spacing between your letters. I use it sometimes when I need to, a piece is feeling just a little bit heavy. I'll add a little extra leading and a little extra tracking just to add some breathe to the piece. So, typeface, type height, kerning, tracking, and leading. You want to control all those if you can while you're working with text.